So, picking up right where we left off, let's add to our scenario a little bit further, because the goal here is we want to create a hypothetical situation that is the most like our current situation, and see if we can put ourselves in those shoes, and if we really would buy into Jesus saying and doing these things with the amount of evidence that we actually do have. Is it strong enough evidence? So let's move on. Now let's say that in addition to everything I talked about in the last video, the four guys telling us this story aren't our friends. In fact, we've never even met them. In fact, it wouldn't be possible for us to meet them because they died a couple thousand years ago. And the only reason you and I are on the receiving end of this information is because they wrote their stories down. Now, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't actually written by the names attributed to them. So we're going to have to throw that into our little scenario here, too. All of the canonical Gospels are anonymous, and they were written that way. None of these manuscripts included a title or an author or a name or anything like that. The only reason that we have the names for them that we do is because the manuscripts were assigned those names later on by various different people for various different reasons. So essentially, not only do we not know the guys telling us this story, we may not even know of the guys telling us this story. Another problem, to spice things up even further, is that whatever it is these guys wrote down, we're not reading that. In fact, we're not even reading a copy of that, or a copy of a copy of that, or a copy of a copy of a copy. The copies we have today are centuries removed from the originals, and no two of them are exactly the same. And when I say copies, I'm not talking about Xerox. There were no printing presses or photocopiers for the first 1,400 years that these babies were being pumped out and passed around. Each and every one of them was tediously handwritten on papyrus or parchment, sometimes by professional scribes who weren't even literate themselves, just capable enough to make a living by copying strange symbols from one page to another, and that's how it went down. But even so, professional scribes weren't even hired to copy Christian texts for the first 2 or 3 centuries that the church existed. That just wasn't a profession in Christianity back then. It wasn't until later on. Before then, the only copies being made were by literate amateurs who wanted them for themselves. Church leaders, community heads, you name it. You combine that with a literacy rate of like 10%, and it means changing or altering text without being caught or confronted was ridiculously easy, absurdly easy, retardedly easy. Keep in mind, we're talking about a culture in which there was no such thing as plagiarism or a copyright or wrongful duplication. There were no standards or practices that instructed people not to duplicate or change or alter or add to or take away from any piece of literature that they could get their hands on, let alone a standard and practice that would enforce that. That's exactly why the author of Revelation at the end of the book pretty much calls down a curse upon anybody who's going to change the content of the text, because it was happening all the time back then. There were so many different Christian sects, each one with their own theological claims about the divinity or non-divinity of Jesus. It wasn't like what you have now. It wasn't cohesive like that. The manuscripts circulating at the time, they weren't specific enough to totally rule out or totally confirm any one of these different ideas, these different Christologies, these different theological points of view. There wasn't a New Testament canon back then. They weren't all reading the same text. They weren't even reading the same versions of the same text. So it was a constant source of heated debate. You had the Gnostics, with which you're familiar already. You had the Docetics, the Adoptionists, the Separationists. You had groups that maintained Jesus was born human, not of a virgin, but became adopted to be God's son at his baptism. You had people who believed that Jesus was totally divine and not human at all. He only appeared to bleed and eat and be hungry and all that for the sake of show. I don't know why, but they believed that he wasn't actually human at all. You had people that believed Jesus was both human and divine, but not like you think of it, like two different beings in one body, and that the Christ inhabited Jesus's body for his ministry and for his miracles, and then abandoned his body right before the resurrection, or the crucifixion. I'm sorry. You had Christian sects that weren't even monotheistic. You had some groups that believed Jesus came from a different, more compassionate and loving God to save us from the punishments of the more vengeful God of the Old Testament. And it goes on and on and on. Each of these different Christian sects thought they had it right. Each of them believed they knew the truth. The sect of Christianity that came out on top got to alter and polish the texts in order to support their own theology and to rule out the possibility of interpreting the text in such a way as to support other theologies. And scholars have found example after example after example of those alterations in the manuscripts that we have today. It's as simple as that. It's survival of the fittest. Just go to your local bookstore. I don't know Bibles that well, but I know you can pick up a New Revised Standard Version. And you can just read the little notes at the bottom. It's pretty good. I mean, it'll tell you this passage wasn't originally in the gospel, or this was originally worded like this, and it's now come to mean something different, or there's all those different kinds of examples of that. I don't know. It's all in there. It's all in there. Just people don't usually bother to read it. So going back to our scenario one last time. On top of everything else, the copies of copies of copies that we're reading have been changed and altered and manipulated in and of themselves. I'm going to try to wrap this up here, try to come to some kind of conclusion. Like we said in the beginning, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Now, the claim in question is that Jesus of Nazareth, the one that we know from history, was and presumably still is the all-powerful creator of the universe, manifest in human form. Yeah, that fits. That's pretty extraordinary. So that's the extraordinary claim. Now let's review. What kind of extraordinary evidence do we have for that? We didn't see Jesus say or do anything that would indicate such. In fact, we've never seen Jesus say or do anything at all. In fact, we've never seen Jesus at all. We don't know anyone who saw these things, nor do we know that an account of these things even exists by anyone who would have seen them. We know that the only accounts which did exist were written not by eyewitnesses and were written not any earlier than 30 years after Jesus died. And unfortunately, we don't even get to know what those accounts had to say because we don't have them, and we never will. We have copies and copies and copies and copies of them, centuries removed from the originals, which we know can and have been altered in historically and theologically significant ways from generation to generation, and so on. Now, I could go on, but just for the sake of comparison, have you ever heard of a guy named Sathya Sai Baba? He's in case you can't answer me, but in case you haven't, he's a South Indian guru, alive today, self-proclaimed living God. That's who he is. He was supposedly born of a virgin, all that stuff. And just to give you an idea of how popular this guy is, he's not some loony running around. Over 1 million people attended his 80th birthday recently. Thousands of his followers have attested to his miracles, which include walking on water, levitation, healing the sick, making food multiply, changing the color of his gown, changing the fruit of a tree, disappearing into thin air, and so on. All confirmed by eyewitnesses, all confirmed by followers of his, sometimes entire groups of eyewitnesses at a time. Yet, I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced, and I'm almost certain that you aren't either. Now, why is that? Why would that be? Why aren't you and I convinced that Sathya Sai Baba, given the evidence, is a living God? Well, it's simple, because it's too extraordinary of a claim, and it's not extraordinary enough evidence. Now, going back to Jesus, the evidence that Jesus of Nazareth was God isn't extraordinary either. It's not even pitiful. 12 perfectly preserved eyewitness accounts, that would be pitiful. Thousands of eyewitnesses like Sathya Sai Baba, that would be underwhelming at best. But what you have, Curtis, is non-existent. So, either it just comes down to a matter of faith, and you believe it because it's part of your culture and it's part of your upbringing and it's all around us and it's pretty hard to ignore. Or, if it is a matter of evidence, then there are far better cases for extraordinary phenomenon than for that of Jesus. My point is that I don't think it's a matter of evidence so much for you. I don't think it's a matter of historical evidence or textual criticism or scholarly work. I think it's a matter of faith. I welcome a video response, and I'm open to having you tell me that I'm completely full of shit. All right, man. Take care. Thanks.